Welcome everyone to Design Bytes, a weekly series that takes a look at and breaks down good, bad, and interesting instances of game design. Get ready to break a whole bunch of stuff, because today we're going to take a look at the Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild's weapon durability system. The inclusion of this mechanic is easily the most controversial thing about the latest Zelda entry, so let's try to understand why some players love it, why some hate it, and how some simple design choices could have made a potential compromise to benefit everyone. The weapon durability system in Breath of the Wild is interesting because it's hard to definitively pin it down as a well-designed or poorly designed mechanic at the conceptual level. It's one of those rare instances where the reception of it can be completely subjective, so the best way to analyze it and learn from it is to understand why some people like it while other people can't stand it. But before that, let's go over how it works so everyone can find some common ground. Nintendo developed Breath of the Wild with a targeted choice to purposely change things up from the series' normal formula that past titles established. In past Zelda games, Link always had access to some sort of sword weapon to use in close-range combat. Depending on the specific adventure, Link almost always obtains multiple swords that serve as story bits and as strength-based upgrades, but they always remain a persistent part of his arsenal. Past Zelda games followed this upgraded weapons formula because they usually had a very linear story that presented the developers with many opportunities to upgrade Link's weapons at predetermined points. With Breath of the Wild's focus being on non-linear and open-world gameplay, Nintendo decided that the combat system itself needed a bit of an overhaul to match this newfound focus in exploration. Instead of giving Link one weapon, he can now hold several at once, and they usually come in 3 different classes. Slow and powerful weapons that are usually axe-shaped, traditional swords that are somewhat quick with decent range, and long-range spears that offer speedy attacks. This variety adds a lot to the combat system, but it's clear that Nintendo wanted to mesh combat and exploration together in some way. To accomplish this, Link no longer has access to a permanent weapon, and instead must find weapons throughout the world to collect. Individual weapons now inflict different levels of damages, have a certain threshold for the number of times they can be used before they break, and have their own unique properties that make them stand out, such as elemental affinities. Once a weapon breaks, it vanishes from Link's inventory, never to be seen again. When looked at from a purely exploration point of view, this system makes a ton of sense. Because there are hundreds of different weapons, and because they each have their own unique strengths and properties, the weapon durability system motivates players to explore Hyrule to find weapons that will benefit Link in combat. This heightened interest in exploration for powerful weapons also means that players who are invested in scouring the world will come across new weapons consistently, ensuring that Link almost always has something to use, despite the fact that his weapons can break. Exploring Hyrule and coming across a really interesting weapon is a great feeling of reward that players can get, so it does match nicely with the core exploration gameplay. In combat, the weapon durability system has a lot of neat benefits. The 3 different weapon types create a lot of variety in player strategy when facing combat challenges. It makes enemy set pieces a lot more interesting because players have a ton of options to deal with them, so it prevents fighting from becoming stale over time, which could be a problem in past Zelda games. The multiple weapon types also demonstrate a concept called skill mastery, where players who invest the time to develop a certain set of skills will be rewarded with a better gameplay experience. In Breath of the Wild's case, this reward comes through the sheer amount of options that players have in combat when they know the full extent of each weapon class's abilities. Since there are so many different pieces of equipment for players to discover, this also has the added effect of teaching players that weapons can interact with the environment. For example, wooden weapons can be lit on fire, and metal weapons can be struck by lightning when held by the player or an enemy. Ice weapons can freeze enemies in place, and some pieces of equipment even have bonuses against certain monster types. So far, this all sounds pretty good, since the durability system does promote the core exploration gameplay, but in practice, there are some notable flaws in the system. At the very start of the game, Link does not have the necessary equipment or status to maximize his exploration abilities, which means that finding adequate weapons is a lot harder. Having weapons break without a clear and replenishable stockpile early in the game can lead to player frustration, and it may even prevent some players from entering fights or enemy set pieces early on. This can unfortunately leave a bit of a negative impression from the very start of the adventure, which may sour the benefits of the system later on for a lot of players. Additionally, the weapon durability system has the unintended side effect of hoarding. While Breath of the Wild generally does a good job of putting weapons of similar strength near each other, the game also rewards exploration with more powerful weapons. This is great, by the way, but it can cause players to find themselves in a situation where they want to preserve a strong weapon and use weaker ones first. It's a legitimate long-term strategy because you never know what you're going to find in Hyrule and when you'll need it most. This results in the game having some unintentional padding in combat. Using weaker weapons constantly means that enemies can feel more like damage sponges, and it can add a significant amount of time over the course of a full playthrough. Outside of the beginning part of the game, having a weapon break mid-fight can also lead to some situations where players may take damage that can feel a bit unfair, and that's just never a fun spot to be in. Weapons breaking also means that there's a lot of time using menus to switch weapons. Constantly accessing menus can break immersion, which momentarily takes players' attention away from the impressive Hyrule landscape. So how do we fix this system to compromise these pros and cons? The answer is pretty simple. Give Link permanent access to at least one weapon, but do it in a way where the weapon is earned, not given or found. The Master Sword would be a great piece of equipment to apply this concept to. Not only does it make sense from its history in the franchise, but players can only gain access to it when they've completed over half of the game's mini-dungeons anyways, and that's assuming they find the sword in the first place. By that point in the game, players easily should have a solid enough grasp on both exploration and combat, while also having access to significantly more powerful weapons that can break still, so it really becomes up to the player if they want to use the sword or if they want to use other pieces of gear. The Master Sword itself does actually have some level of permanence, but it works in a bit of an unexpected way. When it breaks, players must wait several minutes for it to be fixed up before they can fight with it again. This design can frustrate some players because players might not want to waste breakable weapons during that period, so they may avoid combat until the Master Sword regenerates to avoid breaking stronger weapons. Waiting is a bit antithetical to Breath of the Wild's go anywhere, do anything approach, but this could resolve a minor nitpick in the process. One quick note and counterpoint to the idea of a permanent Master Sword. While it sounds good in theory, it is possible that this could have some unintended consequences that could affect the gameplay negatively. It may stale combat options or become a crutch in the late game, or maybe it means that some players will stop exploring every nook and cranny in Hyrule because they don't perceive anything as a worthwhile reward for exploring. But when it's isolated to just the durability system, it does seem to be an interesting idea that could bridge the gap between pros and cons of the durability system. Breath of the Wild is nothing short of a masterpiece, but the weapon durability system is one of a small handful of things that can be seen as quote-unquote controversial. The durability system is difficult to label as an objectively good or bad mechanic, but it's easy to see why the developers went this route, and for their first time, they did a pretty good job. If Nintendo does choose to revisit this concept in future Zelda titles, let's hope that they make a couple of tweaks to make a system that works better for more players.